Welcome, everyone. Thank you for attending this webinar for the state of Minnesota. We'll briefly do introductions. My name is Julian Brubaker. I'm an associate here at REMY, and I'm joined by my colleague May Lin, who's an economic analyst at REMY. And I'll be doing the first half of the presentation, and then I'll hand things over to May, and she'll do a brief model demonstration near the end. So here's what the rest of the webinar will look like. We'll briefly talk about the REMY models, what they are, how we've gotten these numbers, because of course we've used our models to run all this forecasting. Then we'll talk briefly about the regional growth matrix, where we've graphed all 50 states plus DC on two axes, population and employment, compared to the national average. So I'll explain that when we get to it. Then we'll look nationally at the short and long-term forecast, and we'll zoom back in and look at the short and long-term economic outlook for just Minnesota. And then I'll hand things over to May for a model demonstration, and we'll close out the webinar with any questions that you might have. We'll save them for the end. Feel free to put them in the chat anytime during the presentation. And we should get this done in just around half an hour. So REMY was founded 41 years ago on the idea that government decision makers, private industry leaders, and others should be able to test the economic consequences of policy and other major decisions before actually making those decisions or before passing the policy. They should be cognizant, right, of the economic consequences of their actions. And I think the last year has really shown us just how personal policy can be, just how much it can impact people's daily lives. So we feel like it's more necessary than ever. You can see a not at all exhaustive list of our clients down below. We work predominantly with government agencies of all different sizes, but we're also working with more and more private industry leaders as well. All right, let's paint with the broadest brushstrokes what the Minnesota state economy looks like. So agriculture in the state has been declining for a while now, but the crops that are still the most popular, most lucrative include corn and wheat, some hay and barley, and soybeans as well. Some farmers in the state also raise some livestock, and others raise cows for dairy and other dairy products. Lumber is not a terribly lucrative industry for the state. It used to be a century or more ago, but it is much more sustainable today, which is good to see. Fishing, both commercially and sport fishing, is pretty popular, and also is an industry that's becoming more sustainable or more renewable. Minnesota does also mine a lot, though believe it or not, they don't mine fossil fuels. They mine other sort of, fine minerals. Though they do produce some ethanol, and they also refine some oil that's coming in from Canada in the Twin Cities. The state is powered mostly by coal, which is true of most other states in the nation, but Minnesota also has at least one nuclear reactor in the Twin Cities area that can power some nuclear power plant, that can power some of the state's electricity needs. So we'll take a quick glance at this. We've run the outlook here in the short term over a 5-year window from 2019 to 2023. You can see both graphs on the right show that window. In Minnesota, the top graph, you'll see that both output and GDP in gray and orange respectively both declined slightly in 2020, as you might imagine, but personal income actually goes up in 2020 and a little bit in 2021 as well, which is due to the stimulus packages that were passed last year and earlier this spring. Minnesota's employment actually bounces back pretty quickly, more quickly than most other states. We've been seeing by 2022, the state is where it was at pre-COVID 2019 levels. Just over the course of 2020 and 2021, however, we'll see personal income grow by about 2.9% in total by the end of the year. GDP should grow by about 4.7%, output by about 4.4%. And we should see around 138,000 jobs added in total by the end of the year. So things are looking up. I want to say this now, and you'll hear it again throughout the presentation, there's always some uncertainty involved in economic forecasting, especially in times like these. So take everything we're saying with just a grain of salt. I also wanted to pause and just briefly mention the data sources that we're using for the models. So we get our data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Bureau of Economic Activity, the Congressional Budget Office, the Census Bureau, of course. I also wanted to highlight the University of Michigan's RSQE, Research Seminar in Quantitative Economics. Their footnote at the bottom, they include the recent American Rescue Plan, the $1.9 trillion stimulus package, as well as any additional vaccination and consumer spending trends that we've been able to see thus far, and they release their data quarterly. So we have the March 2021 quarter one update for all of these forecasts. All right, moving right into the regional growth matrix. We've graphed all 50 states plus DC on two axes. Our population axis is on the x-axis, so that's looking at demographic factors like population age, number of people retiring in the state, the level of immigration into and out of the state, or migration, I guess, the amenities, what are social welfare, housing costs, those types of amenities. And then on the y-axis, we've graphed our employment factors, including the level of growth in industries, level of pay, compensation for their workers, where are those industries clustered, how productive are they, what's the cost of doing business in the state, those types of things. So we've compared these two factors against the national average. We've compared each state and DC against the national average. So I'll walk through each of these four quadrants very briefly. Starting with the top right, going around clockwise. So our regional growth matrix includes, for starters, our growth economies. So we're looking at states like Colorado, Texas are good examples of these states where both employment and population trends are relatively favorable. So we're seeing, industries that are growing rapidly, pay that's relatively high, and for other reasons, economic activity is quite bustling, and also people are moving into the state at rates that are higher than the national average. So they're either being drawn by the economic activity or for other reasons. Our lifestyle economies in the bottom right, which Utah is a great example of, are economies where, though population trends remain higher than the national average, employment trends are slightly lower. So people are moving to the state generally for reasons other than economic activity for the most part. They're moving there because of the lifestyle, or because of other things that make it a lovely place to settle. Our transitional economies in the bottom left quadrant are economies that are undergoing some major shifts of some kind. So maybe some industries are being replaced by others, or major policies are causing some upheavals, or changes to energy sector, whatever it might be. Maine, West Virginia are great examples of these transitional economies that are going under a number of shifts. So both employment and population trends remain relatively unfavorable as opposed to the national average. And lastly, we've got our Renaissance economies, our top left category, where employment trends remain actually relatively favorable, while population trends remain relatively unfavorable. So the states are losing some people, or if they're growing at a rate slightly less than the national average. But they have relatively high economic activity and employment trends, mainly due to newer industries that might be replacing older ones, pay that has remained relatively high over the decades. Massachusetts is a good example of both of those trends. But for other reasons, the economics remain relatively positive, where population trends are at least slightly less than the national average. So here you'll see the national average, and you see where Minnesota is. It's starred. So pretty close, pretty close to the national average. Just about as close as you can get. So we've categorized it a growth economy slightly, but things are looking very similar to the national average for 2021 and 2022. That's just how we've compared these states for our growth matrix, just in the short term. All right, let's zoom out now that we've been doing some comparisons to the national average, let's zoom out and look at the whole US, and then we'll zoom back in and look at Minnesota. So we've run the same 5-year short-term forecast from 2019 to 2023. You can see the same trends nationally, where personal income actually increases a little bit in 2020 and 2021 due to the stimulus, where GDP and output decrease. And nationally, it takes until, looks like, somewhere in 2023 for employment to bounce back to where it was during pre-COVID 2019 levels. Just over the course of 2020 and 2021, we see personal income growing by about 2.9%, and GDP and output should be growing by about 4.4%. And we're seeing 7 million jobs added to the economy by the end of the year nationwide. Long term, we've run the REMY models out as far as they can go to 2060. So it's a 40-year window here. On average, the growth per year in personal income should be about 1.9%. Growth in economic output also 1.9%, and the growth in GDP should be about 1.8% per year on average. We should see just over 1 million jobs added to the US economy each year. You'll see that more of those will be added in the coming years, the decade of the 2020s, as the US bounces back from COVID, and then employment growth rates become a little more steady, as you can see in the bottom right graph. Okay, let's zoom back in now to Minnesota. We will look a little bit more in depth at employment first, and then at population, these two axes that we talked about in our regional growth matrix. So on the employment side of things, here we're looking at the top 5 fastest growing industries in 2021, which include the construction industry, the wholesale trade industry, professional, scientific, and technical services industry. Healthcare takes up almost a fourth, about a fifth of the total job growth in 2021, and educational services, private institutions as well. So those are the top 5 fastest growing industries. In those industries alone, we should see over 60,000 jobs increasing in total by the end of the year, which is good to see. And here, looking at industries with highest average compensation rates, where we've got finance and insurance at the top, followed by wholesale trade, management of companies and enterprises, information and utilities. You can see the dip in each of these industries in 2020, but they begin to climb back out of it. It looks like they should get back to where they were in terms of employment relatively quickly. These are industries that, for the most part, can adjust to the COVID landscape. Population-wise, there's a snapshot of the population pyramid at the end of the year, what it'll look like in, what is it now, 7 months? Pretty stationary population pyramid. So birth rates are relatively moderate. They're not too low. We're not seeing a population pyramid that has way more older folks than it does younger folks. Age distribution is relatively equal. You do see a big boom, and the baby boom of people in their golden years, their 60s, late 50s, but on the whole, it's relatively stationary. That will change, as we'll see in a few slides. In the long term, that'll change. Here's another more in-depth look at population in the short term. So we're starting at 5.6 million people here in the state, and our births outnumber our deaths by a significant margin. The number of people retiring and leaving Minnesota outweighs the number of people retiring from other states and moving into Minnesota. But people moving into Minnesota for other reasons, other economic factors, they're moving in more than they're moving out, and internationally, more people are moving into the state of Minnesota. So the ending population is a little bit higher than it was at the beginning of 2020. But again, we'll see a long-term picture in a second. So here's a long-term outlook at the most broad level. So again, the same 4-decade time period here. We expect Minnesota to grow by about 2.0% per year in personal income, 1.8% per year in GDP, 2.0% per year in output, and the economy should add about 20,000 jobs to the state each year. Again, you can see a higher percentage of those jobs will be in the next decade as Minnesota bounces back, and then employment growth rates begin to get a little steadier. Let's look at these same employment and population measurements that we just did in the short term, but now looking over this 4-decade period. So you can see that the industries that are growing the fastest, have changed a little bit. Healthcare and social assistance is taking up a good third of the job growth over the next 4 decades. Professional, scientific, and technical services are taking up about a fifth. Forestry, fishing, and hunting, tiny little sliver. Accommodation and food services, transportation and warehousing. Those are the top 5. So you can see the service industry is really increasing here. We're seeing this across the country as population trends change and people get older. But it's certainly happening a little bit in Minnesota. So just these top 5 fastest growing industries should add more than 534,000 jobs to the economy over the next 4 decades. Industries with the highest average compensation rates, you can very clearly see this blip. In 2020, most industries regain, where they were in terms of employment rates. Manufacturing, actually in light blue, takes a more significant dip into the 2030s, but it begins to climb out of that again in the 2050s and 2060s. And I'll let this run twice, just so you can see the way the population is moving through the next 4 decades. But take a look at birth rates. They remain pretty stagnant. Actually, they decrease a tiny bit as the population just begins to age more and more. So population pyramid looks, completely different in 2060 than it did 40 years ago. Much more constrictive pyramid. We're seeing this almost across the board at almost every US state as part of the sort of impending geriatric care problem. But let's dive a little bit deeper into it in Minnesota specifically. So again, we're reading this graph from left to right. Births outweigh deaths by, again, a significant margin. It's a pretty similar picture in the long term, actually, as it is to the short term. So retirees are leaving the state more than people are retiring to Minnesota, but people are moving to the state for other economic reasons, and to a greater degree, people are moving to the state from other countries. So the ending population should be about 6.9 million in 2060. All right, I'm going to hand things over to my colleague May, who will show us a brief model demonstration live, giving a little possible model scenario of the next couple of years. And then we'll open it up to questions. So I'll hand it over to you first, May.
Thank you, Julian. So in the model demonstration part, we will run the scenario of the optimistic outlook. We have just seen the national baseline quantity of the RSQE, CBO, and VA, where the total employment slowly comes back accompanied by a steady growth. But as Julian mentioned, there will be a lot of uncertainty, including large pent-up consumer demand, supports of vaccine, and also stimulus checks. So although it's very difficult to quantify all these impacts, we would like to try an experiment inspired by Janet Yellen, who predicted that the economy could be back to full employment by the end of 2021. We just wanted to test what growth we would have to see in the economy to make that happen. And after testing, we imported a macroeconomic update increasing the GDP growth rate by 2%. Now we can take a look at the total employment changes both on the national level and the state level. So on the next slide, we have the total employment in the US on the left and on the right in Minnesota, with the blue lines representing our baseline forecast and the orange lines representing the forecast where growth in every component of GDP has been increased by 2%. That is to say, if consumption grew by 0.5% from year to year, now it grows at 2.5%. And with that, the US gets back to normal by 2021 and begins to exceed its previous employment in 2022 and 2023. While Minnesota is having a very similar recovery trend, but please Bear in mind that a 2% increase is very optimistic. Only if the vaccine rollout continues smoothly or even ahead of schedule, and if consumer confidence really picks up, we might see something approaching this. Now, let's show off the model and explore more about job increase from the baseline to the optimistic outlook. We're using the REMY model PI Plus, the 51 region model, which covers the 50 state and DC area. The home screen's purpose is to provide quick and simple access points for starting the use of the model and to simulate policy changes. By just clicking on the appropriate tile, you can start creating any one of the 4 types of forecasts available in PI Plus. There are regional simulations, national simulations, regional controls, and national controls. And if you're interested in exploring REMY's default control forecast from the basis of the model, you can dig directly into the data by clicking on regional forecast or national forecast. Let's do regional forecast here for an example. It's going to show only the results section, and some specific tables, maps, and data visualizations have been specially chosen to display REMY's baseline forecasts and also provide informative profiles of the national or regional economies. So for the short-term and long-term outlooks, we just used the national control to import a March update. Well, for the optimistic outlook, we're doing it again, but in the macroeconomic values instead of the March update here as the baseline. We're using the optimistic outlook update with the 2% increase in GDP growth rate. We now have it as macroeconomic change in the inputs list. And the next step is just to run the forecast. But let's skip the waiting and look directly at the results. Here we have region of Minnesota years from 2021 to 2030, where we have the category of GDP. Here are the 2 lines with the lower line representing the baseline and the upper line representing the optimistic outlook. We just imported the gaps between the lines here, the increase in GDP. So as a result, if we look at the total employment, again, we have 2 lines, again, lower line representing the baseline. We see the gap here between the lines is increasing over years, but this is only for total employment. If we want to know about the details, we look at employment by industry. We have comparison type here as levels, which means these lines are showing the actual number of jobs by industry. But since we're interested in differences, when we change the comparison type here, we have the number of jobs increased from the baseline. The comparison forecast here is the baseline and to the new forecast, which is the optimistic outlook. If we zoom in, we can look at the top industry there, healthcare and social assistance. This is pretty much a global thing. The whole world is fighting against the COVID, and we have the second industry, state and local government, followed by retail trade, manufacturing, and also professional, scientific, and technical services and construction. Besides differences, percentage change is very interesting. So before we were looking at industries that are contributing the most job increase, but here in percentage change, we can know which industries are growing the fastest. We have construction, very outstanding. And here we have top industries, including retail, real estate and rental and leasing, retail trade, state and local government. And just for your information, in this model, we have 70 industry sectors. But if necessary, REMY can also do 160 industry sectors. So you can dig into the industry profile really into details. Hopefully these functions can give you a better idea what is happening behind the increasing pool employment. And now I'm gonna give it back to Julian for the conclusion.
Thank you, May. That was really great to see. So in the last half hour or so, what have we learned today? Well, first, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, I'll say it again, economic forecasting is really hard. COVID-19, changes to the federal government as well as state and local governments, on top of the already existing uncertainty around economic forecasting, just means that this is an uncertain time. However, REMY can help, right? We're big proponents of the value of modeling to know as much as you can about your policy before putting it into practice. So we often talk about the 3 C's of economic modeling, or the 3 reasons why someone would use our model. So the first is to clarify a complex policy solution and break it into its parts and highlight connections between them, and otherwise just make something that might seem daunting at first more understandable. Second is to calculate that quantitative hard data that you might need for an impact report or grant application. And the third is to communicate better to stakeholders, to shareholders, policymakers, the public, whoever it might be, really bring that economic impact argument. So REMY's models really allow us to sort of ask these conditional questions, these what if scenarios about the economy. With that, I will open things up to questions. So if anybody has any questions about what you saw today, or about how economic impact analysis might be useful in your organization, please feel free to put your questions in the question box and we'll get to them. We'll get to them now. One person was pointing out that agriculture is not actually declining as much as I thought it was in Minnesota. So that is good to know. I'd be curious to know what types of products agriculture is increasing in. Any other questions? Okay. Well, if I don't see any more coming in, so I'll wait one more second, but if you'd ever like to meet with myself or May or someone from REMY to talk about how impact analysis might fit into your organization, please feel free to email us. Otherwise, I'll just say again, thanks so much for coming to this webinar. We appreciate your attentiveness. Hope to see you sometime soon.
Thank you.